Welcome to the Texas News Podcast, where we dive into all things Texas politics and the future of independence in the state of Texas. On today's show, we're discussing the Supreme Court decision that denies Texas the right to secure our own border. And this one is a doozy, folks. This is going to be one of our most exciting episodes yet. And of course, we're going to be talking about the changing perception around Texit and how it could absolutely be closer than we think. So don't go anywhere.
The border region is going to be lit.
Lights up the blaze, go!
Well, since we were last together for the Texas News Podcast, a few things have happened, right? You probably have heard of what's happening down on the border with Greg Abbott finally making a stand and pushing back against the federal government. The federal government's really pathetic reaction and the rubber stamping by the Supreme Court of the Biden administration policy to cut the razor wire barricades. There is a lot to unpack, so I hope you brought your favorite beverage of choice and are buckled up and ready to do this, because I'm going to be talking about not just the Supreme Court decision, going to be unpacking that, going to give a little pretext for what happened ahead of that to lead to that Supreme Court decision, and talk about the ramifications moving forward. And frankly, all of the consequences that have spun up. I mean, sometimes, and I can't even remember who it was that said it, but sometimes you can get 100 years of history in a single day or a single week, and that's a paraphrase, obviously, but here we are. This is one of those situations where things seem to be languishing a bit, and then all of a sudden, in just a matter of time, here we are. We're at a point where Texit is on everyone's mind, both those for it and those against it. The border issue has now become the forefront of the news cycle, and Texit has become the natural, logical extension of what's happening down on the border. So we are, folks, we're in the throes of getting what we've always talked about we wanted, which is a binding vote, a vote on Texas becoming a self-governing independent nation. And I'll work through the logic of why that is and why it is being talked about by so many people right now. But let's start off by talking about what really led off on this. And guys, that over the years, if you've listened to any of the previous podcasts or have gone back into the history, the deep dives on the TNM website at tnm.me, you're going to know that we've been, and me in particular, we've been very critical of Governor Abbott's response to the federal government over the border issue. We are in the midst of an unprecedented invasion on our southern border. And it's interesting because literally before we fired up the mics to do this podcast, I did an interview with a radio show out in Virginia. And he specifically asked if he wanted me to justify this language about it being an invasion. Not the first time I've been asked that question. Certainly won't be the last. And I think these folks from outside of Texas are looking at it almost as hyperbolic language, right? Like it's an exaggeration. It's really inflaming the situation. They think that it's really just rhetorical and is really pouring gas on the fire. And that's not the case at all. The case for this being an invasion has been made time and time and time again. What we have is a long-standing issue in relation to the border between Texas and Mexico. It's 1,254 miles of border that has very distinct border checkpoints, right? There are legal places to cross the border. But what we have had, even before the Trump presidency, going all the way back to the Obama presidency and even before, we have had a serious situation with border security, where you have the drug cartels that are now expanding their operation into human and sex trafficking. So not only are they pumping fentanyl and other drugs into Texas, but they are trafficking in women and children. It's so bad that, in fact, the cartels, their activity has driven Texas to be one of the top states for human and sex trafficking, right? So, I mean, we're talking about some horrible, horrible situations going on. And of course, this massive surge, this invitation by the federal government that says, "Oh, come all ye faithful," excuse me, this invitation by the federal government that says, "Oh, come all ye faithful," by its lax asylum policy and its funneling of Texas taxpayer dollars through non-governmental organizations to provide travel and housing, and then the federal government's acquiescence to the illegal immigration by setting asylum hearings many years in the future. What we have here is collusion between the federal government, the cartels, and the Mexican government to destabilize the Texas border. And some people say, well, that doesn't sound like an invasion. But let me ask you this question. If the Border Patrol has come out and said that the Rio Grande Valley is in, the cartels are in operational control of the Rio Grande Valley, and the cartels are in fact narco-terrorist criminal organizations, functionally indistinguishable from people like ISIS or Al-Qaeda, with the exception that they don't have a religious ideology unless your religion is money, then, is it truly an invasion? Well, look at the numbers, right? When I campaigned for lieutenant governor back in the last cycle, we were at an unprecedented number of illegal crossings every single solitary month. There were, in fact, more illegals crossing the border, not through the legal checkpoints, but through these other places where they were sneaking across, and they just happened to get interdicted by Border Patrol or the Texas DPS or Texas National Guard. But the numbers were staggering even back then, where you had more people crossing every single solitary month than the number of Allied troops that hit the beaches of Normandy on D-Day. And all of this being facilitated by the federal government and led by the cartels, and frankly, allowed by the Mexican government. And before anyone says that, well, this is, what, do you have a problem with people, with Mexicans coming from Mexico? That's not it at all. In fact, what we have seen is, in this unprecedented surge, which, by the way, those numbers are almost 2.5 to 3 times what they were back during the last election cycle. What we see today is that the border has become the chief point of entry for people that are around the world. So they are not going through the legal process. They are not coming through the authorized points of entry. They are, in fact, doing everything they can to be smuggled across other places along the border. And you have to ask yourself, why is that? Why is that? Well, it's a broken immigration policy by the federal government, for one. But other than that, what you have is an unprecedented national security risk. You see, even the federal government admits that they are now interdicting people that are on the terrorism watch list, people that are responsible for mass killings overseas. Right? There is even an indication that you've got intelligence operatives that are sneaking across through that border from countries and nations that are hostile to Texas and to the rest of the United States. So it is a public safety crisis. It is a national security crisis. It is a public health crisis. And it is all being facilitated by the federal government. And so when you have a non-state actor acting as a criminal, an organized criminal enterprise like the cartels, it is an invasion, right? If you were to take out the cartels and put, say, Al-Qaeda or ISIS, because ISIS was a non-state actor that exercised some of those organizational functions. If you were to take the cartels out and put ISIS in its place, no one would argue that it is an invasion. Not a single person would argue. In fact, they would sound the alarm. But here we are today with the cartels, the federal government, and the Mexican government working hand in hand. So previously on this podcast, we've talked about some of the Texas efforts to secure the border. Many years ago, Operation Lone Star was implemented, where Texas allocated, I think it initially started with $1 billion to $1.5 billion for a biennial budget to begin efforts to secure the border here in Texas, because the federal government was failing to do it. Whether it's intentional or unintentional is not the argument. The fact is the federal government failed in one of its mandated duties to protect the states against invasion. Okay. So in doing so, Texas has taken from Texas taxpayer pockets to fill a gap that is being left by the federal government as it fails in one of its core duties under the Constitution, one of the very few delegated powers to the federal government. And so in doing so, Texas has done all it can to stand in the gap, knowing that the federal government is going to push back against it every chance they can get. And they've done it. Right? Every time Texas tries to do something to secure the border, the federal government comes in and interferes, or they have previously rendered the Texas efforts so neutered as to basically have Texans, the Texas Military Department and the Department of Public Safety, operating as auxiliaries for the Border Patrol, who are under orders to let them across, process them, put them on buses and planes, and ship them everywhere. So this has been part of the reason that we've been critical of Governor Abbott's actions on the border. You can't fix a gunshot wound with a Band-Aid. And that's what it has looked like, that in fact, the Texas government has been not pushing back hard enough, and in fact, just really helping make the situation worse. So what we have is, during the last election, you had both Lieutenant Colonel Allen West and Don Huffines, who were challenging Abbott in the primaries, really crank up the discussion about the border. I did so as well in the run against Dan Patrick, and it became evident at that time from people that there were, based off the discussion and the campaigns laying out the facts of the border situation, that the state government was really not doing anything. They were doing, in the words of Peter in Office Space, they were doing just enough not to get fired, enough that they could put something on a political mailer when it came time for the next election. And that's pretty much the MO for the political class and the political establishment in Texas. Just do enough that you can put something on a mailer that's not a 100% lie. And people that are uninformed about the situation will clap like seals and vote for you again. And that's essentially what has happened. But the last cycle was a little bit different. Interestingly enough, and without going into too much detail, one of the things that happened after the primary but before the general election was that Abbott actually implemented some of the steps that Don Huffines, former state senator Don Huffines, and by the way, Texas First Pledge signer, suggested that be done, which one of the things was stop all commercial traffic from Mexico until Mexico agrees to secure its side of the border. That was one of the things, and Abbott did that for a short period of time. They amped up some of the inspections of commercial vehicle traffic. And I got to tell you, trade is one way that you can pressure governments to do things. I mean, that's just the way that it is. Otherwise, you wouldn't have trade embargoes and sanctions. You can leverage those things. Now, those are two-way streets, obviously, but it was effectively used by Texas to get Mexico, even though the federal government in Mexico wouldn't come to the table. Abbott wound up hammering out separate agreements with the governors of the Mexican states along the border. And in doing so, began to set the tone, I believe, for the pace of where this was going, where those states acting as in their capacity as individual states of the Mexican Union, and Texas acting in its capacity as an independent sovereign state within the Union, began to have these negotiations between one another. It really, in my opinion, set the stage for what has happened over the last couple of weeks. So you've had Abbott slowly begin to ramp up the actions that he's taking. And I say slowly. Sometimes these things don't happen quickly, but it has been slow. But one of the things that happened, I guess it's been a few months back now, is Abbott began ordering the Texas Military Department, the National Guard, and the State Guard, and DPS to begin to deploy razor wire along some of these highly trafficked areas of the border that are not the normal border checkpoints, to basically say, look, here's a place where we have a lot of illegal crossings. The federal government will not deploy the resources to address this, so here's what we're going to do. And what he did was he started stacking shipping containers and deploying razor wire. And it's and he began to take some of the border fencing that was left over from Trump's border wall that had been abandoned by the federal government, bought it and began to deploy some of the aspects of this border wall. Now, remember, we're talking about very small sections here. But what it did was it effectively created a situation where the federal government was going to have to respond at some point. It could not continue on that way because the federal government has a vested interest in keeping that open. And one of the things that happened, and really there were two court cases that really set this off. Number one was when Abbott deployed the river buoys. Right, he deployed buoys that were chained together in sections of the Rio Grande River to keep people from swimming across. And of course, it was hailed as a humanitarian disaster. It's going to cause people to drown. The Mexican government even threatened to sue, and I think, in fact, did sue the state of Texas and sue the state of Texas for the removal, saying it was a violation of the border treaty. I mean, how rich is that, right? Oh, you can't do that on your border. Well, hold my beer, and I beg to differ. So you have this situation where the Mexican government is suing Texas. The federal government comes in on the side of the Mexican government. And then you have this other suit where you had actual members of the Border Patrol caught clipping the razor wire and letting people through the gaps in the razor wire. And in some instances, they were taking forklifts and lifting the border barrier for people to come through. You had the media ramp up and talk about how a woman died because of Abbott's border wall, and the reason being was the lady fell off of it because she was not going through a legal port of entry. She decided to take a ladder and go over, and that's the breaks, right? You play stupid games, you win stupid prizes. Okay. And it's not that I'm callous about that. It's just you can't, if someone were to break into my house and cut their arm on the window that they broke and they bled out, I would not feel bad about it. Don't rob my house. Don't break into my house. Don't break my window. And I think the vast majority of Texans, those that are possessed of common sense, feel the same way as well. If you want to come to my house, you come knock on my front door, and then I will greet you and determine whether I want to let you in or not. That's how it works. That's how it's always supposed to work, okay? So we have the federal government lifting the razor wire, cutting the razor wire, and we have the state of Texas essentially suing the federal government, saying you can't come in here and damage our property. That's the state of Texas property, and you're not allowed to damage it. Which that particular case is what led us to the place that we're at today. You see, the state of Texas, Governor Abbott decided it's time. He said it's time, it's time to bring this to a head. Let's just get this squared away. And essentially went in under an emergency declaration and took over a park in Eagle Pass. Now, for people who say, well, he's not allowed to do that, he is absolutely 100% allowed to do that. Cities are political subdivisions of the state of Texas, and under the emergency order that was issued related to the border invasion, he is well within his rights to come in and secure that park for the purpose of interdicting people on the border. And there's some debate as to why that particular park. But I will tell you from our folks that have been down there, that park was selected for a very specific reason. It is a place where the Border Patrol was indeed facilitating the crossing the illegal crossing of these folks that were coming in through Mexico. It was one of the hot spots. Now, I want to give you a picture here, okay, because that park is about 2.5 miles of the 1,254 mile long border, but it has become the focal point. And so Abbott went, directed the Texas Military Department and the DPS to take over the park, secure the park, and do not let Border Patrol in. Well, that's what caused everyone to lose their minds. Why is he not letting Border Patrol in there? Well, because they are under orders from the federal government to continue to facilitate these illegal crossings. And so by throwing the Border Patrol out and directing the Texas Military Department under Operation Lone Star to secure that park, the border side plus the rest of it, Abbott was able to stop the crossings for at least 2.5 miles of the Texas-Mexico border. So great success. So the federal government, of course, loses their minds over this issue. You can't do that. You have to give the Border Patrol immediate access to that section. And Abbott says, no, I don't. I don't have to give you access to it because we're operating well within our sovereign rights to protect Texas citizens. Where you have failed, we are operating in it. And as such, Abbott was effectively saying, we're the ones that are being constitutional, not you. He said the federal government is breaking the law. You're violating the law and you're violating the sovereignty and the safety of Texas. And as such, we're going to stand up in the gap and we're going to uphold our rights under the Constitution. Now, that is actually a separate issue to the Supreme Court decision. And people get these things very conflated. So I want to be very clear here. The Supreme Court decision was the court case related to the cutting of the razor wire, right? So now we're going to reach back and we're going to pull that happens at the same time. So while this is happening in Eagle Pass, the Supreme Court renders a decision that essentially strikes down the ruling against the Biden administration and sends it back to the lower court, effectively giving the Biden administration the green light to continue cutting razor wire. So now we have the issue with the park. Now we have the Supreme Court effectively rubber stamping a Biden position that says that they can come in and they can remove the razor wire and continue to facilitate this human trafficking, sex trafficking, drug trafficking, and everything else. And then what do we have next? Well, we have the Texit issue. Because you see, when Abbott moved to take over the park in Eagle Pass, interestingly enough, the opposition, particularly Democrats, began to tag this as a Texit issue. They're saying Greg Abbott is making Texit happen. And I will tell you, to the outside world, that's how it is viewed. Now, there have been lawsuits and letters flying back and forth, and I'm gonna take Abbott's letter because there's some sections of it that I want to address specifically that I think help give this some context about where this probably will be heading. Okay, so the Department of Homeland Security fired off a letter to Governor Greg Abbott, essentially telling him, give us access to the park. There have been responses from both Abbott and Attorney General Ken Paxton, basically telling the federal government, come and take it. I mean, if you want to distill down the language to something that Texans are familiar with, that's essentially it. Because in this instance, Abbott asserts that Texas is in the right. But here's what's interesting. So I'm gonna read from his letter really quickly. He says this is literally the first sentence in his response to the Department of Homeland Security. He says the federal government has broken the compact between the United States and the states. Now, that very sentence, those words right there, are extremely important for understanding where this could be headed. Because, you see, when this letter was released, the media, mainstream sort of progressive media lost their minds because he used the word compact, and they said, "Oh my God, Abbott is using this long debunked compact theory." They call him a neo-Confederate. I mean, they're trying to do everything they can to pin this as Civil War Part 2, America Harder, right? I mean, that's really what they're trying to do here. But Abbott used this language, and I believe that he was very specific. You know, I have a lot I've had a lot of criticisms for Greg Abbott over the years, but one thing he has always been is very specific in his language, and it comes from the fact that he was an attorney, he served as a judge, he was the attorney general. So he chooses his words very carefully. So there you go for all of you people who say that I've done nothing but trash talk Greg Abbott. There you go. I just gave you a compliment, right? He is very specific. The federal government has broken the compact between the United States and the states. Well, let's take a look at that really quickly, because the use of the word compact is not some, Confederate or neo-Confederate jargon. It is, in fact, the words of the word used. The compact is the word used by the framers of the United States Constitution. You find it littered all throughout the Federalist Papers. Understanding that those who drafted the Constitution viewed the United States as an entity, not unlike the European Union or NATO or any of these others, where you had these individual sovereign states that joined together into a compact that was governed, the rules of which were governed by the United States Constitution. That was what they said, the people who drafted it. And I have to say that they probably know a lot more than some, ridiculous reporter from Salon or Politico or one of those other rags, right? This idea that the United States is not a compact is absolutely Lincolnian, right? It comes from this myth that developed to foster some unity post-Civil War. And so you will hear them refer to it as a compact theory, but it's not a theory, it's the compact fact. Because at the moment that they deny that it's a compact, well, guess what? Now they're in violation of Article 1, Section 1 of the Texas Constitution. You see, no state would have joined the Union if they thought they were giving up their individual character and sovereignty. It never would have happened. Texas would have never joined the Union in 1845, and no state would have tolerated a continued existence in a union that absolutely instituted a totalitarian despotism centered in the Washington District of Criminals. It's just not the way that it would be. And so I can't help but think that Abbott chose his words very carefully, because understand that in Article 1, Section 1 of the Texas Constitution, it says that Texas is a free and independent state subject only to the United States Constitution. And it says that the maintenance of our free institutions and the perpetuity or continued existence of the Union depends on the right of local self-government unimpaired to all the states. And so at the moment that Greg Abbott penned these words, that the federal government has broken the compact between the United States and the states, under Article 1, Section 1, Greg Abbott was essentially saying and declaring that the Union was done as it is today. And that's powerful. It's massive. And it has a lot of meaning as we move forward. Abbott talks about, in his letter, he talks about his defense and why he's doing this. And he makes the case for why the border crisis is an invasion, and for how Texas is holding the line and obeying the Constitution, and the federal government is violating it. He says right here, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and the other visionaries who wrote the U.S. Constitution foresaw that states should not be left to the mercy of a lawless president who does nothing to stop external threats like cartels smuggling millions of illegal immigrants across the border. That is why the framers included both Article 4, Section 4, which promises that the federal government shall protect each state against invasion, and Article 1, Section 10, Clause 3, which acknowledges the state's sovereign interest in protecting their borders. And he even cites the case in Arizona v. United States. He says the failure of the Biden administration to fulfill the duties imposed by Article 4, Section 4 has triggered Article 1, Section 10, Clause 3, which reserves to this state the right of self-defense. For these reasons, I have already declared an invasion under Article 1, Section 10, Clause 3 to invoke Texas constitutional authority to defend and protect itself. That authority is the supreme law of the land and supersedes any federal statutes to the contrary. The Texas National Guard, the Texas Department of Public Safety, and other Texas personnel are acting on that authority as well as state law to secure the Texas border. So there you have it. And I'm not going to read his entire letter, but there you have it in a nutshell. Greg Abbott is making the case, and I think it's a case that has needed to be made for quite some time. It just so happens that this is the place where it is. It's in this 2.5-mile section of park in Eagle Pass. And while people may think that that's underwhelming, and including me saying, look, we've got, what are you going to do about the 1,250, what was it, 251 and a half other miles of Texas border? And I think that people are missing the bigger picture and the connection with our history. We were talking about, and for those of you who haven't seen it, I was a guest on Tim Pool's Culture Wars podcast, and we got to actually talking about this issue. And I've been asked a lot if the comparison to this issue is like the Alamo, and it's like, no, that's not what it is at all. It's actually more like during the Texas Revolution, the Battle of Gonzales. For those of you who don't know the story, essentially the Mexican federal government and the Constitution were overthrown and usurped by that dictator Santa Anna and the people within the government called the Centralists, who wanted to centralize power in Mexico City and essentially render the states as vassal states, to say that you don't have any rights other than what we give you out of the central government. Does that ever sound familiar, right? And so, as such, at this long tail end, and I'm not going to detail all of Texas history, one of the things that happened was the military was dispatched to the small town of Gonzales in Texas to confiscate a cannon. And if you've never seen the picture of this cannon, it's quite small. Like I said on Tim Pool Show, I'm pretty certain that there are people here in Texas recreationally that have rifles that are more powerful probably than that cannon, but that cannon was given to that colony for self-defense. And the Mexican military rolled up and said, we're taking the cannon. And the Texans hoisted a flag, that iconic white flag with a picture of a single star and a cannon and the words, come and take it. And this is where we are today. We are at that point where you have the governor of the state of Texas, and frankly, the vast majority of Texans right now, that are looking at this situation and looking at how Texas is trying to defend itself and seeing our sovereignty and our rights usurped by a centralist government in Washington, D.C., and we're saying, come and take it. It is an act of defiance, but not really. It is, in fact, Texas standing up for our rights, the law, and our sovereignty. Our very fundamental right to govern ourselves. Welcome to Article 1, Section 2 of the Texas Constitution. This is where we are. And some people may say, look, we're going to, they make these ridiculous assertions that they will send in the military and this is the start of a civil war. I don't think it's the start of a civil war. I hope it's not. But the next move is really on the federal government and the Biden administration. Because at the end of the day, you do right no matter what the consequences are. You don't stop doing the right thing because someone decides that they're going to do the wrong thing if you do the right thing. You do the right thing every single solitary time. And the right thing here is that appeal to first principles, the right of self-government, the right of self-defense, the sovereignty of Texas, standing up for what the framers intended for this relationship to be between the federal government and the states, to put the federal government back in the box, which we know it will not go into, and to finally explore and make happen what we know will ultimately solve the problem. And that is acknowledging that the federal government cannot be fixed, acknowledging the words that Greg Abbott used, that the compact is broken, and reasserting our status as an independent nation, and doing those things like securing our border and setting a sensible immigration policy that all independent nations by right have the ability to do. So this has, again, has accelerated well beyond anyone's, expectations. But what do we have? We have governors from other states signing on to support Greg Abbott and sending in National Guard troops. Again, not an unusual situation. Other states have sent National Guard troops to Texas to help with Operation Lone Star in the past. But now, as of the recording of this podcast, I believe we're at 25 states that have said, you know what? We're siding with Texas on this one. Texas has it right, and the federal government has it wrong. And the response from the federal government has been to begin this rhetoric, to send, again, tersely worded letters demanding access to the park, and and basically calling Texans a bunch of names. I mean, how juvenile, right? But the next move is on the federal government, and the discussion is, and the rhetoric is ramping up by the opposition, that this is an insurrection. Boy, that sounds familiar. They're echoing that this is a civil war. The media is even on the warpath, saying that this is being encouraged by Russia. Here we go with the Russian collusion BS again, right? I mean, what a bunch of crap. So all they're doing is recycling the same old tripe, but the concrete action that could, in fact, happen. The discussions are already happening that the federal government could step in and federalize. Guys, please stop using the word nationalize. It's not nationalizing the troops. It's federalizing the National Guard, and that is an important distinction to make. I'm not trying to be the word police, but let's get this right. They want to federalize the National Guard and potentially arrest anyone who does not obey that order to federalize. This is something that we predicted would happen many years ago, even under the Obama administration. It's why it's been the official policy of the TNM since 2012 to shift all of this from the National Guard to the Texas State Guard. You see, the Texas Military Department has 3 branches, 2 National Guard and 1 State Guard. And State Guard is exclusively under the command of the Texas governor. The Texas governor operates as the commander-in-chief and cannot be federalized. So indeed, what could happen is all of that effort could be shifted into the State Guard. And it's something that we've advocated since 2012. And it was something that I mentioned on social media, and it got picked up by everyone. I mean, everyone was talking about it. I've done countless interviews about this idea that if Biden federalizes the National Guard, that Greg Abbott should immediately get all of that equipment from the National Guard, issue it to the State Guard, fully militarize the State Guard, open enlistment wide open, right? Just get those recruiting offices open 24/7 and take any prior military volunteer who wants to come in and join the State Guard and deploy them as a border protection force, a force that cannot be federalized. So the next move is on the Biden administration. What are they going to do? Are they going to federalize those troops? Are they going to send more tersely worded letters? What's going to happen? Someone is going to back down. Will it be Governor Abbott? And which would be an unprecedented act of political immolation, beyond a shadow of a doubt. Or will it be the Biden administration who backs down? But understand, at this point, Texas is holding the line. There is no escalation for us other than basically doing what has been done in Eagle Pass across the entirety of the border and beginning to expand that operation. And there are some indications that may be the case, that may be what's coming. The fact that you have a call that went out from the Texas Military Department right now, I think it was this morning that it went out, seeking volunteers within the Texas Military Department for border action to basically bolster the troops. They want people to deploy within the Texas Military Department. They want them to deploy to the border voluntarily, which speaks to the fact that there is an anticipation of an escalation from the federal government, or there is an intention to expand this border operation beyond Eagle Pass and roll it out to the remaining areas of operation that are part of Operation Lone Star. So we will see what happens with this. But if there, as I said, there is no indication that there would be any escalation on the part of Texas. No one wants an escalation, but the federal government may. And if they indeed do escalate, with 25 states already signing on to Texas efforts, does this mean, if the Biden administration and really his puppet masters, the people that are keeping him propped up like Weekend at Bernie's, if they make the decision to ramp this up and turn up the gas, does that mean then that we are going to see the spinning off not just of Texas, but of the remaining states, of those other 25? And what does that mean for the union? It's interesting times we live in, folks. And I think that we are headed to a place where this is beyond a constitutional crisis. I believe it is a crisis of conscience. Do we value those fundamental principles that we think of as America, or do we cling to a failed political and economic entity known as the United States federal government? Because that's the option. You know, when I look on social media and I see guys like somebody we've talked about quite often, the State Representative Jeff Leach, talking about, I will never abandon this country. Well, what are you willing to sacrifice? Which one of your principles are you willing to lay on the altar and sacrifice to the God that is your federal government? What are you willing to compromise just to preserve the Union? I mean, we know that Lincoln was willing to compromise the writ of habeas corpus, due process, hundreds of thousands of lives. I mean, as an individual, guys like Jeff Leach, let me just ask you, what is your red line? What are you willing to give up? How far do they have to go until you say enough is enough? Because I got to tell you, the stuff that we're taking right now from the federal government it has been enough to propel 2/3 of Texans to say they believe that we should become a self-governing independent nation. And any further delay to the outside world in even having this discussion and denigrating those who want to have it just looks like cowardice. Just looks like you're ready to capitulate. And, we saw that during the years before World War II. We saw Germans do the exact same thing, willing to sacrifice what they knew was right, in the sense of just being able to go along to get along, for that greater sense of Germany, right? So which one of your principles are you willing to compromise? Because let's be honest, if you're willing to compromise your principles at this point that we're in history, then you'll compromise anything. You can't be trusted in an outhouse with a muzzle on. If you're willing to deny people the right to decide their government, if you're willing to violate Article 1, Section 2, then anything is on the table, right? At the point that people say, well, the Supreme Court said that they can cut the razor wire. Well, that's wrong. That's wrong. It's immoral for that to happen. And let's be honest, it's not like it's the first time the Supreme Court has made what is frankly an immoral decision. I mean, we're talking about the same entity that said that black people were property in the Dred Scott decision, right? So it's not like the federal government and its institutions are the paragons of virtue. So what are you willing to sacrifice in your personal life just to preserve those institutions? And what in the world are you willing to sacrifice if you're an elected in an elected position? What are you willing to sacrifice from our lives to preserve that? or at least to not even have the conversation. You willing to sacrifice your honor, the honor of your family, the sovereignty of Texas, our individual rights? What's on the table? And I'm going to tell you, Texans are tired of letting electeds use our rights as a bargaining chip. Something we talked about on a podcast some time back when the border security funding bill was tied to funding for Ukraine and funding for Taiwan. And it's like, why is our security here in Texas tied to anything else? Why is our safety and security being used as a bargaining chip? And so let me just tell you, the fact that the Biden administration wanted to do that makes people like Jeff Leach and some of these other politicians that are dumping on the Texit issue, it makes them functionally indistinguishable from Joe Biden's policies. But that's not uncommon, right? All of those people that are out there right now on social media railing against Texit and calling it, that secessionists should be bombed, and they call it sedition and treason. Guess who else says that kind of stuff? That's the kind of stuff that the Communist Chinese Party says about Hong Kong and Taiwan. They jail people for just even talking about secession or independence and autonomy for Hong Kong, or the fact that Hong Kong should be able to have its. Your position is no different than one of the most autocratic governments on the planet that is a horrible abuser of human rights. And I got to tell you, I didn't have it on my bingo card to watch some of these people that are supposedly staunch, go America. I didn't have it on my bingo card to see them cozying up to the Chinese communists, to start quoting out of essentially Mao's playbook. But really, should we be surprised? So the byproduct for all of this is that Texit has entered the discussion. I mentioned it earlier as a prelude to this to let you know we were going to get here, and this is where we're at. We're everywhere. The Texit issue has been everywhere, starting even before all of this border kerfuffle jumped off. The discussion about Texit has started ramping up. For those of you who have not heard the news, we got the cover of Newsweek, and that's not shabby. It's funny, when I let Dr. Quartrup, which some of you know that I've talked about him before, but when I let Dr. Quartrup know, he says, hey, you don't understand how big this is. He said that magazine cover is going to be seen everywhere around the world. He says it's going to be everywhere. And sure enough, that is indeed the case. But you've had tweets from everyone about this issue, and media going crazy about this thing, like Texit just suddenly popped up, right? And that's fine. I mean, I forgive them for being late to the party, but the fact of the matter is it shows absolutely no sign of going anywhere. And I'm going to tell you, you can also tell that the rhetoric has ramped up from the opposition. We had this open letter from that was posted in the Fredericksburg Standard Radio Post, which is a very long name for a newspaper, but it was a commentary that was submitted by a former GOP precinct chair and a former GOP county chair in Fredericksburg, Texas, there in Gillespie County, which is the heart of Kyle Biederman's district. And he goes through this nonsense where they're both talking about, first off, there's a bunch of lies in here that are just not. I could take an entire thing to unpack this, but they literally start talking about that we're guilty of seditious conspiracy, right? I mean, and literally they are the capitulators, the quislings that I talked about a moment ago, where they say, while secession advocates state that a Texit vote is free speech and only advisory in nature, does anyone really believe the federal government would allow such secession and relinquish federal properties, some of which are deemed essential for national defense? Actions of active promoters of Texit could be construed as seditious conspiracy, thus causing a major internal conflict, dividing and pitting us against each other. I mean, you want to talk about the kings of unfortunate timing. We literally are standing at a place where the federal government is doing this very thing, causing a major internal conflict, dividing and pitting us against each other, where the federal government is indeed violating the Constitution. But yet here we are, and somehow we're the seditious conspiracy people, right? I mean, really and truly, this little screed is about as ridiculous as you could possibly get. But it represents what is really and truly the desperation of the opposition. I talked about it a moment ago. This idea that somehow Texas is, that the federal government, that talking about Texit is just a bridge too far. But yet they're willing to accept whatever the federal government hands to them. So it is, my friends, interesting times that we live in. We are at this point in history where we're going to be having a tremendous amount of history happening in a short amount of time. I will say this before we wrap up, because we've been together for quite some time. But I will say this: we are without a doubt on the cusp of seeing the Texit issue happen. We will be going within days to deliver all of those petition signatures to the governor's office. We've already sent the letter indicating that it's going to happen, but we're going to be taking those petition signatures there. And people like Matt Rinaldi, who decided that, just like Joe Biden, that your rights and the law were a cafeteria plan, he can choke on it. And all of these politicians, all of these, these fake Texans are going to have to make their decision. You have guys like Lion Lynn Stuckey up there in Andy Hopper's race in HD 64, the guy who literally is the only way that we know that he's not a piece of furniture in the Texas Capitol is that if you sit on him, he's uncomfortable, right? This guy does nothing, but he gets up and he tries in his best Biden word salad to denigrate Andy for signing the Texas First Pledge, which these idiots think the Texas First Pledge is a pledge to support Texit. That's because, look, I'm going to let you in on a secret. A lot of these guys in the Texas legislature are just stupid. They're just stupid. They're illiterate. Okay. And if you don't believe me, go watch Dade Phelan try to read from a piece of paper that was handed to him by the Obama administration parliamentarian that they got running the Texas House. They're just illiterate or just stupid. And Lynn Stuckey is one of those. Jeff Leach is one of those. They can't read. The Texas First Pledge is a pledge to respect the right of the people of Texas to vote on this issue. And I will tell you that there are some of those folks that sign that pledge that are very much like our former land commissioner, Jerry Patterson, who said, I want it to go on a ballot so I can vote against it. I respect that position, because at the end of the day, just like we criticize Rinaldi, they are not here to be the gatekeepers. If they really and truly believe in that oath that they took to support the Texas Constitution, they will let the people of Texas vote on this issue. And that's where we go. We go to Governor Abbott next for the purpose of delivering these petition signatures and let him know that the people appreciate what he's doing right now on the border, but also we want to vote on our future. And then we go into the polls as early voting opens up very shortly. I think we're a couple of weeks out from the opening of early voting. And we go in and we cast our ballot for candidates that absolutely believe in the right of the people to vote on this issue, that believe that Texans are the best people to make the choice for Texas. Not 2.5 million unelected federal bureaucrats in Washington, D.C., and not a bunch of elitist political establishment hacks in Austin, Texas. Texans need to have a say in our future. So, with that, my friends, we are going to wrap this up. I could literally talk about this for 2 more hours, but I'm sure there will be a lot more. I'm going to wrap it up today and just remind you, wherever you are listening to this, be sure to like, comment, subscribe, do everything, do all the things wherever you're hearing this, whether it's on YouTube, Spotify podcast, Apple Podcasts, any of those places. And be sure to share the word, right? We're getting a lot of media right now, but it's more important that you help us share this message with everyone who wants to hear it. And my message to those out there that are listening, that are watching, that are outside of Texas, number 1, get here before you need a visa to get here. Or number 2, take what we're doing and consider what it would be like for your state to be a self-governing independent nation, right? So that being said, I also want to remind you all that if you have any questions about Texit, head over to texitnow.org, get your questions answered, and be sure to share those with people who have questions as well. Until the next episode of the podcast, thank you so much for being here week in, week out on the Texas News. And I will leave you with the words of Sam Houston, who said that Texas will again lift its head and stand among the nations. My friends, I believe that time is now, and the question is, will you stand with her?